Hey everyone, it's great to see you and welcome back. And before we get started, I'd like to say that if you like the video, please like the video and subscribe. Would love to have you join the community. And today, the game we're going to talk about is Final Fantasy 16. Wow, there's 16 of these things. Plus, of course, 10 million expansions and additional games in their universe and so on. So Final Fantasy 16, it's a 2023 action RPG game developed by Creative Business Unit 3 at Square Enix. I gotta say, I love after the restructuring at Square Enix that we have such memorable studios: Creative Business Unit 1, Creative Business Unit 2, Creative Business Unit 3, making Square Enix's biggest AAA titles. But a name doesn't necessarily define the quality of their work. I just think that's pretty funny. And this game, I was very much anticipating. When I first started to see things about it, I loved the idea that they were going to go back to something a little more medieval fantasy. Final Fantasy had been stuck in this kind of electronic world, futurist sci-fi world for so many titles and for so long. It was pretty cool to see them just trying to do something, kind of take it back to the roots or get a little more original in today's modern franchise of Final Fantasy. I also liked what we saw initially at E3. The gameplay seemed interesting, and then I got my hands on the demo, and when I played the demo, I was more 50-50 on it. And a big part of my critiques was just it didn't capture me right away. And so I didn't play too much of it. I just wanted to get a little appetizer. But I waited. The game came out. I got it at a pretty good deal, and I recently completed it. So I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about the game. Before we talk about it specifically, let's just look at the game itself. So this is I believe this is the original artwork. It's a reversible insert, so we'll look at the other side. And we have Clive and his brother Joshua on the front, and these are of course two really important characters in the game. I did like the spine is okay. This spine, the font almost sticks off of the spine itself, and I don't know if I have another Final Fantasy game for comparison, but historically the Final Fantasy titling on the spines has been basically the same font, same size. So they're really cool to display next to each other. And then this gremlin comes along, Final Fantasy 16, and just does something super different. But not a big deal. And on the back, we get to see a little bit, just a little taste about what we're going to be in store for. Fate is written in the fire, and it has some things about you're going to explore the world. It's an action RPG. There's icons. And then, of course, we get all the legalese at the bottom. And something just occurred to me, but do people really... I mean, you can't even buy physical games in most retail environments. And so when you look at the back of a game, is that enticing to gamers still? I kind of wonder. It is to me, but I don't know about other people. On the inside, we get a little trial here for Final Fantasy 14, which I've never played. I've thought about it. And a little... ad as well for Heavensward, which is an expansion for the game, and some other legal stuff. And then here's the disc. I like the disc art. It kind of stays with the traditional Final Fantasy style of kind of the silhouetting of themes, main characters, and so on and so forth. And then I'm just going to pop the insert out here. So this is the alternative insert, and I think this one has very cool art. It looks pretty cool. Clive on the front. But I'll keep it traditional, the template way that the game came, and so we'll leave it on the original artwork. Let me just put this thing back together. So the story goes in the development of this game, which was pretty interesting, that the CEO of Square Enix, Matsuda, he approached Yoshida, who's the director and producer behind Final Fantasy 14. And basically said, hey, I want you to start working on the next mainline Final Fantasy game. And this is years back. It's 2015, 2016 or so. And I would assume a big part of it is, around this time, Final Fantasy XIV was really starting to break out and have a lot of success. I mean, this is 10 years later and the game is relevant. Maybe my timelines are wrong, but I believe Final Fantasy XIV has been around that long, right? And so assuming that Yoshida was likely chosen for these reasons, Naoki Yoshida, and Creative Business Unit 1 was taking on the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And so Creative Business Unit 3 was in a perfect position to start working on something new. And Yoshida, he was working on the newest expansion now, Heaven's Word, and was, sucking his teeth and, I don't know, it's going to be a lot. So I'll step down as producer, but I'd like, his name's Hiroshi Takai, to come work as the director on the game. I've worked with him on Final Fantasy XIV. I love his work. He's great. And so Takai did exactly that. He took up the role as the director. And so they started production on the game in 2016. And, they took a lot of things into account. So the team really wanted to address some of the criticisms at the core of Final Fantasy 15 that people had, primarily in the role of its open world design and also the delivery of the story. And of course, when you play open world games and you try to consume a main storyline, it's not as straightforward necessarily. And open world was originally considered for Final Fantasy 16, but kind of due to some extended development times, delays because of COVID-19, etc., they ultimately kind of stripped that back and went to a more level approach. And another couple things in mind, Takai really wanted to focus on making something easily digestible in terms of its mechanics and its combat style. A really straightforward action RPG game that presented mature themes, themes that you could, an adult or a kid playing the game could really find some interest in. And one of my favorite things is I always familiarize myself with some of the background development of these games. One of my favorite thing was that Takai had mentioned he really wanted to get away from anime tropes, which I thought was funny. Anime tropes being, I guess, well, I don't know. I won't even comment on those. But they really wanted to just make something that artistically was different, visually was different, just overall different from what we had from Final Fantasy games in recent history. And so I thought it was pretty cool overall, I gotta say. And the game went on to be pretty well received by critics. And so let's talk a little bit about it. I beat it. That's a little history about the game. First thing I always want to talk about is the story. And so there's a lot here. So I'll try to condense it as much as I can. So Final Fantasy XVI takes place in the world of Valisthea. And this world is essentially powered by mother crystals. And these provide something called ether energy, essentially. So there are some humans out there, they're known as bearers is what they're called, and they can use this magic without the crystals. The average person has to use the crystals to kind of produce magic, but you have these bearers, and the bearers are considered like freaks of nature, essentially. They're kind of like, yeah, they got problems. So then there's also something called Acons, and these are basically a higher form of magic and connection to the gods. And there are people out there called dominants, and the dominants can use Acons in order, one dominant can use a particular Acon, basically making them, essentially a god. So within the world of Valisthea, there's various nations, and a lot of them have a dominant that's kind of at the top of their nation, a leader, a royalty, etc. typically. And then, I mean, there's just so much here. I'm trying to read some of the notes that I took just to tell you about the story. But that's a bit of background about the world. There's the dominants, invoke a significant degree of influence and power, the people who have those, because of their ability to use them. And so taking all that back, Clive, he is a bearer. So he has phoenix powers, so he has magic of the phoenix that he can use, like fire and stuff like that. And he is the bodyguard for his brother, Joshua. And something tragic happens to their father, And because of that, Joshua kind of freaks out and unleashes his Akon, the Phoenix, and gets into a fight with another Akon, Ifrit. And at the core of this, nobody knows who was controlling Ifrit, who was the dominant who summoned Ifrit. And so Clive kind of goes on this adventure to discover that, and kind of what happens to him. Following this event, he's enslaved, and he meets another dominant, Jill, who was a former person at the palace and whatever with Clive as well. So yeah, they go on this journey with this other dude, Sid. They are on a quest to find the dominant, Ifrit's dominant, and yeah, that's basically the core of the story itself. So I have a couple things I wanted to share about the story. Firstly, this game, it's a whole new world in so many ways, not just in its setting, in its themes, in its environment, and so on. And so the game really has a true obsession with lore and giving you so many ways to access lore about this game. I swear they hired a dude just to sit for 3 years and just world build through lore. And so there's everything. There's this active time lore where you can access lore in the middle of cutscenes and things. There's this person, Vivian, who you'll work with later in the game, who does these State of the Realm reports where you can talk to her and she'll tell you about current events going on and politics and what's happening between the nation states. There's this dude called Harpocrates, and he has the times, which are ways in which you can access lore systems by talking to him and updating him on things going on that you've experienced during your journeys. There's cutscenes and cutscenes of dialogue that go on, expressing and explaining to you many of the things going on in the world in kind of a Metal Gear Solid fashion, where it's not about exactly what's happening in the present moment, but it's this history, it's this geography lesson. And so while that was good, I'd say it was a little overwhelming. I was just learning so much. They're just cramming things in my head. I was like, are we taking an exam soon or something? Because this is crazy. And so at a certain point in the game, I just kind of turned my brain off and I stopped paying attention to a lot of that stuff so I could just enjoy the gameplay itself. But yeah, I mean, that was a lot really getting to me. One of the big inspirations for the game's narrative and the way in which it was going to be presented was the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, which the first few seasons I thought were pretty solid of Game of Thrones. And so I thought that was cool. The way they tackle it here in the game is nice, because for a lot of franchises that I grew up with as a child, it's always, Pokemon's a great example, right? Pokemon, I played all of the Pokemon games up until Black 2 was probably some of the last ones that I truly engaged heavily with. And a big part of it was that as I got older, the franchises were not aging with me as a player. And so nowadays, if I go play Sword and Shield, they really feel like little kid RPGs because of the fact that they are designed for little kids. And that's never changed. And that's at the core of the DNA of the Pokemon Company and Game Freak. So, no critique on me here. I'm just describing it exactly as they have also said. But it was something that as a gamer I just kind of aged out of. So to come play Final Fantasy 16, where they're thinking really on the age of the people who grew up with Final Fantasy, which I was the age of like Final Fantasy 7 on the PlayStation. It's cool that they're just trying to keep with the times and their core base, because I would assume the average person playing Final Fantasy games is maybe not a little kid anymore. It's probably people who grew up with these franchises and really love them. And so I was just happy to see them take that approach. Yes, the lore is a lot, but I think the moment to moment when you're experiencing Clive's story was very engaging and interesting, and so I liked that quite a bit. So another thing I thought was interesting was some of the themes here. I think a big theme has to do with clashing identities, because that's what you'll experience throughout the game, is the politics of these warring nations between each other and their dominance and so on. And I thought it was interesting that I read that the crystals in this game, which has been a recurring theme in a lot of Final Fantasy games, but here in the game they're really an allegory to fossil fuels, right? This rare resource that is slowly kind of dwindling away, while the Akons are really representative of these weapons of mass destruction, right? And so if you have a dominant on your side and you have an Acon, you're basically unstoppable, or you're a terrifying force. And so, that was something that thematically they wanted to present as part of the world politics in which this game takes place. So the story, I thought, was pretty engaging, pretty interesting, and I did follow it from beginning to end, enjoying the cutscenes and kind of going along, just taking out some of that lore and putting it to the side for later digestion. And so, yeah, I mean, that's about it. Moving on to gameplay. So, the game has a real-time battle system. You'll essentially go from level to level, following along the main storyline. That's about it. You'll walk around, you'll pick things up off the ground, you will interact and watch cutscenes and fight in battles and so on. And yeah, I mean, that's a big core part of the game. The fighting itself is real-time, action RPG style. I did quite enjoy how simple it was, but how you could also make it a little more complicated as you go along. You have a standard attack move, a standard spell move, some hotkeys for using items. You can dodge, you can jump, and that's the extent of what you can do in battle. And later on, as you get new Acons, you will be able to get some special moves that you can begin to swap and change as part of your fighting style. And so I thought that was very cool, just in terms of as the game goes along, you really are kind of growing as Clive is growing, you're growing as a gamer and finding new ways to interact with the systems. I would compare it to something like Devil May Cry, but when you compare this to, say, Devil May Cry 5, it's definitely a little more trimmed back. And a reason I want to make that comparison too is that some of the scenario designers and folks who worked on Devil May Cry 5 came and helped build out the battle system for Final Fantasy XVI, to my understanding. So I wanted to just kind of, that's why I played Devil May Cry 5, a few months back, and I reviewed it on the channel. I wanted to experience that game before I jumped into Final Fantasy XVI, just so I could get a feel for what exactly was going on here. So the combat is definitely simplified, but if you do like Devil May Cry games, I think as you go along in this game, you're going to really start to engage with the combat dynamics and enjoy them quite a bit. The one thing I will say is that once I really began to feel out my strategy, the special moves that work for me and skills that work for me, my fighting became very format in the way that I could just annihilate people with a few very solid moves and a strategy of going in and attacking, using this special move, that special move, waiting for them to cool down while I pull off this and that. And so towards the end of the game, I was mostly just executing those moves in a specific order to destroy everybody. And so that could be a fault of the gamer, in which I was just not experimenting enough. Or it could also indicate that I just min-maxed the crap out of Clive, and here I was pretty OP and just destroying everybody. And from a game designer's perspective, you'd probably want players to have more time to interact with the systems and flesh them out and experience them in other ways other than just this one specific style they found. I will say that part of that, it comes from the fact that the battles can be pretty static in terms of what you can do. The game doesn't have status effects. There's no magic typing in terms of weaknesses and strengths of specific enemies, bosses, etc. And so you never really develop unique fighting strategies as you identify enemies that you're up against on the field, because any specific move will do the same damage output in any specific way that you wanted to apply it. And so once you start looking a little deeper into the system, you've kind of already found the bottom, so there's not going to be anything additional that you can start to really kind of play around and customize your character to really get deep into the fighting system. And so as a result, there's also a little lack of replayability there, or need for you to go out and re-explore areas you've been to, and so on. So but that's really the core of the fighting system. I'll say as well, I thought the fighting and the combat in the game is flashy. It's awesome. It really feels punchy. And when you get into the boss battles, they can be very epic. They can be very epic at times, and so cool and just out of control. So I think even just for that, the experience alone of playing this game is worth it. The only one thing I'll say about those epic battles is that the way they keep the player engaged is through QuickTime events, and I don't like QuickTime events very much. I think they are kind of inhibiting to either enjoying the cinematic or playing the game. You really got to choose one or the other. And you can see the evolution of what you can do with gameplay itself, I think, through like Resident Evil 4, where in the remake, they've taken the QuickTime events out and replaced them with gameplay moments that really enhance it. And so I don't know exactly how you do that with how epic some of these battles get, but I would have preferred if they just left the QuickTime events out and just maybe stuck to cinematics for these moments. That way I could just really enjoy what was happening on the screen instead of trying to engage and press a button over and over again. But yeah, those are kind of the big things. I also wanted to call out that I really appreciate the limited HUD in the game. At many times there's no HUD on the screen at all, and so you can just really dive in and enjoy the visual aspects of this game, the art of the game. And so I always really appreciate when a game is doing that. Once you have kind of completed a main quest area, you're welcome to go back into areas and explore and fight enemies and complete side quests. Most of the quests are going to be fetch quests, are going to be rescue quests. Occasionally a quest will just literally be like, go talk to this guy and then come back. And so I found that the replayability aspects outside of the main story, it's more like a task list than it is like something I personally really wanted to engage with. And so that didn't really work for me too much. I also think that the fact they went to a level design basis as opposed to the open world, with how much lore and how much they wanted to tell you about the nations and the geography and so on through the discussions in the dialogue and in all of these different lore consumption methods. Having it be level by level really made it hard as a player to connect with the specific regions, areas, and peoples that they were trying to tell me about when going through that lore stuff. And so I think from those perspectives that the open world design may have worked a little better for me. I understand that there were timing and budget constraints and things like that, and so that's a big part of why they might have gone for the level basis. But that was just my perspective. It was a little harder to engage with the narrative. I did like the levels though. The level design was great. And there are some areas where it is semi-open world where you have very big areas to walk through and explore and look around. But I just wish these were connected, even if by an empty field, even if by a little tunnel that you could just load and move to the next area without opening a screen that you have to fast travel or find a waypoint then you can go to this area, that area. And so that was something else that kind of stood out to me. But overall, I really did have a great gameplay experience. It was a fun game that you could dive into. It wasn't super deep, so you could just engage right away with the combat and enjoy the game. And so I did very much appreciate those aspects of the game as well. Okay, another thing I wanted to move on to was just to discuss the sound in the game. Final Fantasy is known for its incredible soundtracks. This game, to my understanding, has over 200 songs made for it. And a big part of why there are so many songs is that the sound team really wanted to ensure that there were no repetitive moments here. I mean, most RPGs have a battle theme, where literally every time you go into a battle, you're going to hear the same exact song every time. And as someone who's played a lot of RPGs, maybe that just becomes a drone in my mind because I don't really think about that, a handful of hours into the game. But also it creates some memorability, right? Like there are games where I can really vividly remember the tunes and melodies of the songs that are playing as they're playing and the moments. And so having over 200 songs, while that's insane as a quantity, I don't remember too many pieces. There's a really kind of beautiful arpeggiated electronic song that plays in one of the semi-open worlds when you break out into it, some portion into the game. But aside from that, I thought most of the music kind of went in one ear and out the other in terms of me processing and remember like, ooh, I really like this song. I gotta go listen to this soundtrack later. And so, that was just my experience. But I will say that the music itself very much matches the tone of the gameplay. It's incredibly epic. There's these huge, vocal moments, choral moments, and a lot of that, there's so much drama in the music that does play. that I enjoyed. So yeah, and so musically, that's where it was at. From a voice acting perspective, the voice acting was really solid. Not too much to say there. I will say that a lot of the side moments, the side characters, and so on and so forth, when you talk to them, they didn't voice some of the lines. And it's weird because other times they do. I just found that kind of jarring. I wish they would have either taken an approach where they didn't voice many of the lines and just left it to like the cutscenes and the main characters' dialogue, or they would have voiced all the lines. And, you know, they've done that in many of the Final Fantasy games, so I wonder why they decided to trim that out here. And the last thing I really want to cover, well, two last things. Graphically, the game is fantastic. On PS5, it really impressed me, especially with the effects and the sprites and the lighting. I was just constantly blown away at just how good the game looked, how good the visual design was. And I personally wanted this medieval fantasy setting to come back, and so I loved everything they did with it, from interior designs of buildings to wandering around in woods that really just feel just so dense and like they go on forever. I was just impressed visually with playing the game, and I think Final Fantasy is a series that always sets the mark, and so I think Final Fantasy XVI does that here again. What I will say is that on the PS5, you can play it on 60 frames or 30 frames. In 30 frames, really still struggles. They've done patches for the game to kind of improve the performance, but I did find that it felt like a very chugging experience. And I'm not a person who shares the perspective that 60 frames is an absolute standard. I think there are moments when some games at 30 frames not only play plenty fine, but look great and do set a cinematic tone when enjoying those experiences in that way. So, but graphically here, I think for an action RPG, you're going to want to play it in 60 frames anyway, but of course that does inhibit the looks of the game if that's what you care about. I tried playing it a little bit on both, and that's kind of ultimately how I set the rest of the game to go about. So those are a lot of the big thoughts. The story was pretty solid. It has some high highs, and I was engaged all the way to the very end, and I thought that the story wrapped very well, beautifully, and I liked what they did here quite a bit. Gameplay wise, it's not very deep, but it is very enjoyable. It sticks around for, I want to say I probably put 50, 60 hours into this game. So by the end, I was a little wishing that there was a bit more depth to the gameplay, but the combat is super fun and flashy and just great to look at, if anything. I think it's worth it just for that alone. The music didn't really engage me too much, and I thought there was some opportunity for them to flesh out how far they went with the voice acting and for characters. And the game's beautiful. It was just great to look at. I was personally very happy with my experience playing Final Fantasy XVI. It was a very fun game. I don't know how the game has sold. Square Enix is very hard on its teams to sell. I think usually most of the sales goals are like, I went out and bought the game, I became a fanatic, a rabid fan, so I had to go buy 8 more copies, and then that's when Square Enix says, okay, yeah, we're on set to hit our targets. So I hope the game sold well. I heard that right after release, the entire team disbanded and went to work on other Final Fantasy projects, but I thought what they did here was very cool. It was different, and it worked for me. It really did. And so that was kind of my perspective of the game. Have you played Final Fantasy 16? I would love to know your thoughts on the game, if so, or if you plan on giving it a try. And all aside, I really appreciate you tuning in, listening, checking out the video, hearing my thoughts. And so look forward to seeing you next time if you like the video or if you decide just to subscribe. So, all right, y'all. Well, until then, stay healthy, stay well, and see you next week. All right, later.